The courtroom was quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional shuffle of papers. It was a small room in downtown Chicago, one of many like it scattered across the city. Rows of wooden benches lined the walls, filled with people waiting for their cases to be called. The air smelled faintly of old wood and stale coffee, a reminder of countless hours spent here by those who had no choice but to endure. At the center of the room stood Chuck Norris. He wasn't dressed in anything flashy, just a plain white shirt tucked neatly into dark slacks, paired with simple black shoes that looked well worn but sturdy. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if he were simply waiting for a bus, instead of standing before a judge. His face bore no trace of worry or anger, only calmness. To anyone watching, he appeared unremarkable, an ordinary man caught up in an ordinary day at court. But there was something about him, something hard to put into words. Maybe it was the way his eyes seemed to hold infinite patience, as though he'd seen everything life could throw at him and more. Or maybe it was the odd stillness that surrounded him, like the world itself paused whenever he exhaled. Whatever it was, Karen Miller noticed it immediately. Karen was sitting near the back of the room, scribbling notes on her notepad. A young journalist working for a local newspaper, she covered minor legal proceedings as part of her beat. Most days, these stories amounted to little more than filler material for the paper's less glamorous pages. But today felt different. There was something unusual about this case, or rather about the man at its center. Chuck's name had been mentioned briefly when the clerk announced the docket. Vandalism charges, they said. Nothing serious, just some graffiti on a public building. Yet as Karen glanced over her notes, she realized none of the details added up. Why would someone like him, who radiated such quiet dignity, be involved in something so petty? She leaned forward slightly, trying to catch snippets of conversation between Chuck and his lawyer, but all she heard were soft murmurs exchanged in hushed tones. Then came the disruption. Officer Patricia, Pat Doyle, burst through the double doors at the rear of the courtroom, her boots clacking loudly against the tiled floor. Everyone turned to look at her, including the judge, whose expression shifted from mild annoyance to outright irritation. Pat didn't seem to care. Her uniform was immaculate, pressed and polished to perfection, but her demeanor was anything but professional. Her jaw was clenched tightly, her lips curled into a sneer, and her hands balled into fists at her sides. "You!" she barked, pointing directly at Chuck. Her voice echoed off the walls, sharp enough to make several people flinch. "You think you can pull this crap in my city?" The room fell silent. Even the judge hesitated before speaking, unsure of how to handle the sudden outburst. Chuck, however, didn't react at all. He simply stood there, gazing at Pat with an unreadable expression. If anything, he seemed almost amused, though it was impossible to tell for sure. "What is the meaning of this, officer?" the judge finally asked, adjusting his glasses. "This is a court of law, not a shouting match." Pat ignored him completely. Instead, she marched down the aisle toward Chuck, her movements stiff and aggressive. When she reached him, she planted herself inches away, glaring up at him despite the height difference. "I know your type," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Always thinking you're above the rules because you've got some fancy accent or weird name. Well, let me tell you something, you're nothing special here." Chuck tilted his head slightly as if considering her words. Then in a voice so calm it bordered on surreal, he replied, "I understand your frustration, officer, but I assure you I am not responsible for what you claim." That only made Pat angrier. "Don't give me that garbage. You think I don't. See right through you? People like you come into this country, take advantage of our system, and then act all innocent when we call you out on it." She jabbed a finger into his chest, emphasizing each word with venomous precision. "You're scum. All of you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged nervous glances. No one dared to speak up, not even Chuck's lawyer, who looked torn between defending his client and avoiding further conflict. The tension in the room was suffocating. Karen watched intently, her pen hovering above her notebook. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Sure, Pat Doyle had a reputation around town for being abrasive and quick-tempered, especially when it came to dealing with minorities. But this was beyond unprofessional. It was downright cruel. What struck Karen most, though, was Chuck's reaction, or lack thereof. While Pat ranted and raved, he remained perfectly composed, his gaze unwavering. It was as if he were observing her from a great distance, studying her like a scientist might study an insect under glass. And yet, there was no malice in his expression, no hint of hostility. Just patience. Finally, Pat took a step back, crossing, her arms over her chest. "You've got nothing to say for yourself, huh? Typical. Cowards like you always clam up when confronted." Chuck sighed softly, almost imperceptibly. "Officer Doyle," he began, his tone measured and deliberate. "If you would allow me to explain—" "Explain what?" Pat interrupted, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "How you defaced public property, how you lied to the police during questioning, or maybe how you planned to skip town once we caught wind of your little scheme." "I did none of those things," Chuck said firmly, though his voice never rose above a conversational level, "and I suspect you know that deep down. Your anger isn't about me, it's about something else entirely." For a brief moment, Pat faltered. Her confident facade cracked ever so slightly, revealing a flicker of uncertainty beneath. But just as quickly, she masked it with renewed aggression. "Don't try to psychoanalyze me, pal. I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive." Before Chuck could respond, the judge slammed his gavel onto the bench, the sharp crack reverberating through the room. "Enough!" he shouted, his patience clearly worn thin. "Officer Doyle, I will not tolerate this kind of behavior in my courtroom. Either state your business clearly and professionally, or leave immediately." Pat hesitated, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to regain control. After a long pause, she muttered something under her breath and stormed out of the room, slamming the doors behind her. The sound echoed like thunder, leaving everyone stunned. As the commotion died down, Karen found herself staring at Chuck again. He hadn't moved an inch throughout the entire exchange. In fact, he seemed completely unaffected, as though Pat's tirade had been nothing more than background noise. It was unnerving and fascinating all at once. After the hearing concluded, Karen decided to approach him. She waited until the crowd had dispersed and the courtroom was nearly empty before making her move. Clutching her notebook tightly, she walked over to where Chuck stood, now speaking quietly with his lawyer. "Excuse me," she said tentatively, clearing her throat. "Mr. Norris?" Chuck turned to face her, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. For a split second, Karen felt as though she were standing on the edge of a vast ocean, dwarfed by its sheer immensity. But then he smiled, a small, warm gesture that instantly put her at ease. "Yes?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm Karen Miller," she introduced herself, holding out her hand. "I'm a reporter with the Chicago Daily News. I was covering the hearing today and, well, I wanted to ask if you're okay. That officer, she really crossed a line." Chuck shook her hand, his grip firm but not overpowering. "Thank you for your concern, Miss Miller," he replied, "but I assure you I am fine. Officer Doyle's actions are a reflection of her own struggles, not mine." Karen frowned, intrigued. "Do you really believe that? Even after everything she said?" Chuck nodded slowly. "People often lash out when they feel threatened or afraid. Understanding that doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does help us find compassion for them." His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Karen opened her mouth to ask another question, but before she could, Chuck's lawyer stepped in, apologizing politely but firmly insisting they needed to leave. As Chuck followed him out of the courtroom, he glanced back at Karen one last time, offering her another enigmatic smile before disappearing through the doors. Standing there alone, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just witnessed something extraordinary, something far bigger than a simple vandalism case. And deep down, she knew her story was only beginning. Patricia Pat Doyle couldn't sleep. It wasn't just the stress of the day or the lingering frustration from her encounter with Chuck Norris. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Every time she closed her eyes, strange images flashed in her mind. Glowing symbols, shadowy figures moving through fog, and a voice whispering words she couldn't understand. The dreams felt so real, as if they weren't dreams at all, but glimpses into another world. By midnight, Pat gave up trying to rest and wandered into her kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water, staring blankly at the wall as she sipped it. Her apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. Normally, this silence would have been comforting, but tonight it felt suffocating. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her phone buzzed on the counter, startling her. Picking it up, she saw a string of notifications, social media posts, news alerts, memes about her confrontation with Chuck Norris. Someone had leaked footage of the courtroom incident, and now it was everywhere. Most of the comments were critical, calling her out for her behavior. But what really caught her attention were the conspiracy theories. People weren't just mocking her. They were speculating about Chuck himself. One video showed a slowed-down clip of Chuck standing perfectly still, while everyone around him moved normally. Another highlighted his eyes, claiming they glowed faintly in certain frames. There were even claims that he'd somehow erased himself from official records, leaving behind only rumors and urban legends. Pat scrolled through the posts, her heart pounding faster with each one. None of it made sense. How could someone like him exist? Was he even human? The more she read, the angrier and more terrified she became. Anger because she hated feeling foolish, like she'd been played for a fool in front of the entire city. Terror because deep down, she suspected there might be truth to these wild accusations. Chuck wasn't normal. She'd known it the moment. She laid eyes on him, even if she hadn't wanted to admit it. Unable to sit still any longer, Pat grabbed her jacket and keys and headed out into the night. She didn't know where she was going until she found herself parked outside Chuck's house. The neighborhood was dark and quiet, the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened. But tonight, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Pat crept up to the front door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. To her surprise, it wasn't locked. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the windows, casting shadows across the walls. Everything looked ordinary enough. A couch, a coffee table, a few framed photos. But there was an undeniable aura of strangeness about the place. On the table sat objects that sent chills down Pat's spine. Stones carved with intricate patterns, a wooden box etched with symbols she didn't recognize, and a glowing amulet resting on a piece of black velvet. Her curiosity got the better of her. She picked up the amulet, turning it over in her hands. It was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly as though alive. Suddenly, her vision blurred, and the room around her dissolved into darkness. She found herself standing in a desolate landscape, surrounded by fire and smoke. Above her loomed monstrous creatures with jagged teeth and glowing red eyes. They roared, their voices deafening as they advanced toward her. Pat screamed and dropped the amulet, snapping back to reality. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest as her heart raced. What had just happened? Had she imagined it? No. It had felt too real, too vivid. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a trinket. It was dangerous. Before she could process what she'd seen, a voice spoke behind her. "I wouldn't recommend touching that." Pat spun around to find Chuck standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. For once, she didn't feel anger or defiance, only fear. You're not human," she stammered, backing away from him. "What are you?" Chuck sighed, stepping closer. "I am a guardian," he said simply, "sent here to protect your world from forces you cannot comprehend." Pat shook her head, refusing to believe him. "This is insane. You're lying. None of this is real." "It's as real as the ground beneath your feet," Chuck replied calmly. "And unless we work together, your world will face destruction." Meanwhile, Karen Miller was sitting in her apartment, poring over notes from her conversation with Chuck earlier that day. She'd written down everything he'd told her about his mission, his powers, and the impending threat. At first she'd thought it sounded like science fiction, a story too fantastical to be true. But the more she thought about it, the more it began to make sense. The anomalies she'd noticed in the courtroom footage, the strange artifacts in Chuck's home, even Pat's bizarre meltdown, all pointed to something far bigger than anyone realized. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Karen reached out to Dr. Alan Grant, a physicist known for his research on quantum mechanics and parallel dimensions. She'd interviewed him once before for a feature article, and though he was eccentric, he was brilliant. If anyone could help her understand what was happening, it was him. Alan agreed to meet her at a cafe near his lab the next morning. When Karen arrived, he was already seated at a corner table, sipping coffee and scribbling equations on a napkin. He looked up as she approached, adjusting his glasses with a distracted smile. "Karen, right?" he said, extending a hand. "Good to see you again. What's this urgent matter you mentioned?" Karen slid into the seat across from him and pulled out her notebook. "It's complicated," she admitted. "But I think I've stumbled onto something extraordinary." Over the next hour, she explained everything. The courtroom incident, her meeting with Chuck, the visions she'd experienced, and the artifacts she'd seen. Alan listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes or nodding thoughtfully. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin. "If what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "then we're dealing with phenomena beyond our current understanding of physics. Parallel dimensions, interdimensional beings. These aren't just theoretical concepts anymore, they're real." Karen nodded eagerly. "Exactly. That's why I need your help. If there's a way to detect or measure these entities, we have to find it, before it's too late." Alan tapped his pen against the table, lost in thought. Finally, he spoke. "There might be a way. I've been working on a device designed to detect fluctuations in space-time, tiny ripples caused by dimensional breaches. If we can calibrate it properly, we might be able to pinpoint when and where these threats will appear." Karen's eyes widened. "That's incredible. Can you do it quickly?" "I'll need some time," Alan admitted. "But if this is as serious as you say, I'll prioritize it. In the meantime, keep me updated, and whatever you do, stay safe." As Karen left the cafe, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in days, she had hope. Not just for herself, but for humanity. If Chuck, Alan, and she could work together, maybe they stood a chance against whatever was coming. Back at Chuck's house, Pat was still reeling from the vision she'd experienced. She sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly together as Chuck explained his mission in greater detail. He told her about the ancient war between his people and the malevolent force threatening Earth, about the sacrifices he'd made to fulfill his duty. By the time he finished, Pat's initial hostility had softened into something resembling shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "For everything I said, everything I did. I didn't know." Chuck placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You couldn't have known," he said gently. "But you can choose what happens next. Will you let fear control you, or will you stand with us and fight?" Pat took a deep breath, wiping her tears away. "Tell me what I need to do." Chuck smiled faintly, a spark of pride in his eyes. "First, we prepare. Time is running out." As dawn broke over the horizon, three unlikely allies, Chuck, Karen, and Pat, set to work, each driven by their own reasons but united by a common goal. Together they gathered supplies, tested equipment, and formulated plans. The battle ahead would test them in ways they couldn't imagine, but one thing was certain: they wouldn't face it alone. Back at the police precinct, Officer Patricia Pat Doyle stormed into the break room, slamming her fist against the vending machine so hard that it rattled. The other officers glanced up from their coffee cups and sandwiches, but quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. Pat was known for her temper, and no one wanted to be on the receiving end of it today. "What's eating you, Pat?" One of her colleagues, a burly man named Steve, finally asked cautiously. He knew better than to pry too much, but the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. That guy, Pat growled, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. That Chuck Norris, or whatever his name is. He thinks he can just waltz into this country and act all high and mighty. I swear people like him make me sick. Steve raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of his coffee. You mean the vandalism case? From what I heard, the evidence against him wasn't exactly solid. Pat stopped pacing and glared at him. Evidence? You think I need some piece of paper to tell me he's guilty? Come on, Steve. Use your head. People like him always have something to hide. They're slick, manipulative, or maybe he's just innocent, another officer chimed in half-jokingly. Her name was Lisa, and she had a reputation for being the voice of reason in the department. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Pat, you've got to admit, this whole thing felt kind of off. Did you see how calm he was? If I were guilty, I'd be sweating bullets by now. Pat scoffed, dismissing Lisa's comment with a wave of her hand. Calm? Yeah, sure, that's what they want you to think. Act all cool and collected, try to fool everyone, but I wasn't born yesterday. I know his type. The conversation fizzled out after that. No one wanted to argue with Pat when she was in this mood. She grabbed a soda from the vending machine, popped it open and took a long swig, glaring at the wall as if it had personally offended her. Deep down, though, there was a tiny flicker of doubt gnawing at the edges of her mind. Why hadn't Chuck fought back? Why hadn't he shouted or cried or shown any sign of fear? It didn't make sense. Most people cracked under pressure, especially when faced with someone like Pat. But Chuck, he'd been different. Meanwhile, Karen Miller sat at her desk in the newsroom, staring at her notes from the courtroom. The words blurred together as her thoughts raced ahead. Something about Chuck Norris didn't add up. Yes, he seemed polite and composed, even in the face of Pat's aggression. But there was more to it than that. There was something almost otherworldly about him. She flipped through her notebook, rereading her observations. His eyes, that was it. They weren't normal, not in the way they looked, necessarily, but in the way they made her feel. Like they could see straight through her, past all the layers of pretense and insecurity down to her very core. And then there was the way he moved, or rather, the way he didn't move. He stood so still, so perfectly balanced, that it felt unnatural. Human beings fidget. They shift their weight, adjust their posture, blink constantly. But Chuck? He barely blinked at all. Karen shook her head, trying to snap herself out of it. She was letting her imagination run wild. This was supposed to be a straightforward story. A minor legal case with a racist cop making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Simple. Boring even. Except, it wasn't boring. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed on the desk, startling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her editor reminding her that the deadline for the article was looming. Sighing, Karen opened a blank document on her computer and started typing. As she wrote, however, she found herself veering off course. Instead of sticking to the facts, she began weaving in details about Chuck's demeanor, his eerie composure, the strange energy that surrounded him. By the time she finished, the draft read less like a news report and more like the opening chapter of a mystery novel. Before sending it off, Karen decided to do a little digging online. She pulled up search results for Chuck Norris, hoping to find something, anything that might shed light on who he really was. What she discovered blew her mind. Hundreds of videos, memes, and articles popped up, all claiming that Chuck Norris was some kind of superhuman warrior. Some joked about his legendary toughness, saying things like, Chuck Norris doesn't read books, he stares them down until they give him the information. Others claimed he'd single-handedly defeated entire armies or walked on water without breaking a sweat. At first, Karen laughed it off as internet nonsense. But the deeper she dug, the harder it became to dismiss everything outright. One video caught her attention in particular. It showed grainy footage of a man who looked eerily similar to Chuck standing in the middle of a desert, surrounded by swirling sand and glowing lights. The clip was short and clearly edited, but there was something unsettling about it. Something real. Karen closed her laptop, her heart racing. Was it possible? Could Chuck Norris actually be more than human? The idea sounded absurd, even to her. And yet, the pieces fit together in a way that couldn't be ignored. His unnatural calmness, his piercing gaze, the way Pat's accusations seemed to roll off him like water off a duck's back, it all pointed to something extraordinary. Determined to get answers, Karen decided to track Chuck down. She called the courthouse and managed to get his address from a clerk who didn't ask too many questions. Armed with nothing but her notebook and a growing sense of curiosity, she drove to the quiet suburban neighborhood where he lived. When do you? She arrived. She parked her car across the street and watched the house for a few minutes. It was a modest place painted white with blue shutters and a small garden out front. Nothing about it screamed mystery or superhuman. Just an ordinary home in an ordinary neighborhood. Taking a deep breath, Karen stepped out of her car and approached the front door. She knocked twice, her pulse quickening with each passing second. When the door opened, she found herself face to face with Chuck once again. He didn't seem surprised to see her. In fact, he looked almost as if he'd been expecting her. "Miss Miller," he said, smiling faintly. "I thought you might come." Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "How did you?" "It's a long story," Chuck interrupted gently. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Please, have a seat." Hesitant but intrigued, Karen followed him inside. The interior of the house was simple and tidy, with minimal furniture and warm lighting. On the coffee table in the living room sat a collection of strange objects, stones etched with unfamiliar symbols, a small wooden box with intricate carvings, and a glowing amulet resting on a velvet cloth. "What are these?" Karen asked, pointing at the items. "They're tools," Chuck replied cryptically. "From my world." "Your world?" Karen repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mean, you're not from here?" Chuck nodded slowly. "Not originally, no. I am, or was, a guardian. My people exist outside your dimension, tasked with protecting worlds like yours from threats beyond comprehension." Karen sank onto the couch, her mind reeling. "This has to be a joke," she muttered, half to herself. "There's no way." "I understand your skepticism," Chuck said, sitting down across from her. "But consider this. Why hasn't anyone noticed how unusual I am? Why does the world seem to bend around me, accommodating my presence without question?" Karen thought back to the courtroom, remembering how no one had batted an eye at Chuck's bizarre behavior. How everyone, including the judge, had accepted his calmness as completely normal, despite the chaos unfolding around him. It was as if reality itself conspired to keep his secret safe. "So, what are you doing here?" she asked finally, her voice trembling slightly. "Why Chicago? Why now?" Chuck's expression darkened. "Because danger is coming. A force older than time itself seeks to invade your world, to consume it. My mission is to stop it, or die trying." Karen stared at him, her journalist instincts screaming at her to write everything down, to document every word. But part of her, the rational, grounded part, resisted. This was insane, impossible. And yet, she believed him. As they talked further, Karen learned more about Chuck's origins, his powers, and the cosmic war raging just beyond humanity's perception. Each revelation left her more awestruck than the last. By the time she left his house hours later, her worldview had shifted forever. On the drive home, Karen couldn't stop thinking about what she'd learned. She knew she couldn't publish the full truth, not yet anyway. The world wasn't ready for something like this. But she also knew one thing for certain. Chuck Norris was no ordinary man. He was a protector, a warrior, and perhaps the only thing standing between Earth and unimaginable destruction. And somewhere deep inside, she felt a spark of hope. Because if someone like Chuck existed, if someone so powerful and compassionate was willing to fight for humanity, then maybe, just maybe, There was a chance they could survive whatever was coming next. The days leading up to the breach were tense. Chuck Norris, Karen Miller, Pat Doyle, and Dr. Alan Grant worked tirelessly, each contributing their unique skills to prepare for the unknown. The makeshift command center was set up in Alan's lab, a cluttered space filled with monitors, wires, and strange machines that hummed softly as they scanned for anomalies. Charts and diagrams covered the walls, mapping out potential weak points in Earth's dimensional barriers. Despite the chaos, there was an unspoken sense of unity among them, a shared determination to protect humanity from what lurked beyond. Chuck remained the calm anchor of the group. He moved through the lab with quiet purpose, offering guidance, when needed but rarely speaking unless spoken to. His presence alone seemed to steady everyone else, even Pat, who had transformed dramatically since her encounter with the amulet. Gone was the brash, angry officer. In her place stood someone humbled and focused, eager to make amends for her past mistakes. She spent hours poring over maps and data, learning everything she could about the threat they faced. Karen, too, had changed. Once skeptical and unsure, she now embraced her role as a bridge between the team members. Her natural curiosity made her invaluable, asking questions that no one else thought to ask and connecting dots others missed. She interviewed Chuck extensively, documenting his knowledge of interdimensional warfare and translating it into terms Alan could use to refine his technology. At night, she wrote articles hinting at the danger without revealing too much, enough to warn people without causing panic. Alan, meanwhile, was in his element. His passion for science burned brighter than ever as he fine-tuned the device designed to detect dimensional breaches. It was a complex contraption, resembling a cross between a satellite dish and a particle accelerator, with blinking lights and whirring gears. Every few hours, he would adjust its settings, muttering to himself as he analyzed the readings. "We're close," he said one evening, rubbing his tired eyes. "I can feel it." And then, it happened. The alarm blared suddenly, shattering the relative calm of the lab. Red lights flashed overhead as the machine emitted a high-pitched whine signaling a massive disruption in spacetime. On the central monitor, a map of Chicago lit up with a pulsating red dot near the city's outskirts. Alan rushed to the controls, frantically typing commands to stabilize the signal. "It's here," he announced, his voice trembling with both excitement and fear. "The breach, it's opening." Chuck stepped forward, his expression grim. "Everyone, gather your gear. We don't have much time." Within minutes, the team assembled outside the lab, loading equipment into 2 vans. Pat drove the first vehicle, gripping the steering wheel tightly as adrenaline coursed through her. Baines, Karen rode shotgun, clutching a notebook filled with emergency protocols. In the second van, Chuck and Alan prepared weapons and tools, some advanced, some ancient, that would hopefully give them an edge against whatever emerged from the rift. They approached the location marked on the map. The air grew colder and an unnatural stillness settled over the area. Trees swayed slightly despite the absence of wind, and shadows stretched unnaturally long across the ground. The red dot on Alan's handheld scanner pulsed faster, indicating they were close. "This is it," Pat said, parking the van near an abandoned warehouse. "What now?" "We go in," Chuck replied simply. He led the way, moving with deliberate steps toward the building. The others followed, their breath visible in the frosty air. Inside, the warehouse was dark and cavernous, its interior littered with rusted machinery and broken crates. A faint glow emanated from the far end of the room, drawing them closer like moths to a flame. When they reached the source of the light, they found themselves standing before a swirling vortex, suspended in midair. It looked like liquid fire, shifting colors rapidly as if alive. From within came eerie whispers, overlapping voices speaking in languages none of them recognized. The hair on the back of Pat's neck stood on end as she stared at the portal, her instincts screaming at her to run. "Stay sharp," Chuck warned, raising a glowing staff he'd brought from his collection of artifacts. "They'll come soon." He was right. Moments later, the vortex began to expand, spilling creatures into the warehouse. They were grotesque, their forms twisted and malformed with jagged limbs and glowing eyes that radiated malice. Some crawled on all fours, while others floated eerily above the ground. Their presence filled the room with a suffocating sense of dread. "Now!" Chuck shouted, swinging his staff in a wide arc. A burst of golden energy erupted from the weapon, striking several of the creatures and disintegrating them instantly. Inspired by his actions, Pat drew her service revolver and fired repeatedly, aiming for the glowing centers of the beasts' chests. To her astonishment, the bullets seemed to work, dissolving the targets upon impact. Alan activated one of his devices, a handheld gadget emitting a low-frequency pulse that disrupted the creature's movements. "Aim for their cores," he yelled, dodging a clawed appendage as it slashed through the air where he'd been standing seconds earlier. Karen stayed near the rear, recording everything with her phone while shouting updates to keep the team coordinated. "Two coming. From the left. Watch your backs," she called out. Her voice steady despite the chaos around her. When one of the creatures lunged at her, she grabbed a flare gun from her belt and fired, sending it reeling backward before it dissolved into ash. The battle raged on, each member of the team playing a crucial role in holding the line. But the tide began to turn when more creatures poured through the breach, overwhelming their defenses. Just as hope started to fade, Chuck raised his staff high, chanting words in a language older than time itself. The amulet around his neck glowed brighter, resonating with the staff's power. "No," Pat cried, realizing what he intended to do. "You can't sacrifice yourself." "There's no other way," Chuck replied, his voice calm but firm. "Trust me." With a final surge of energy, he slammed the staff into the ground, creating a shockwave that rippled outward. The vortex shuddered violently, its edges collapsing inward until it vanished completely. The remaining creatures let out ear-splitting shrieks before disintegrating into nothingness. Silence fell over the warehouse, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing. Exhausted but victorious, the team regrouped, their faces etched with relief and sorrow. "You did it," Alan said, clapping Chuck on the shoulder. "You saved us." Chuck shook his head. "We did it. Together." Pat knelt on the floor, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For everything." Karen approached Chuck, her camera forgotten, in her hand. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "For now, the threat is contained," Chuck replied. "But this won't be the last time Earth faces such dangers. You must remain vigilant." As dawn broke outside, casting warm light into the warehouse, the team shared a quiet moment of camaraderie. They had faced the impossible and prevailed. And though the road ahead would be long and uncertain, they knew they weren't alone. The aftermath of the battle left everyone changed. The abandoned warehouse, once a battleground filled with chaos and danger, now stood eerily quiet. The air smelled faintly of burnt metal and ozone, a lingering reminder of the forces that had clashed there. Outside, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the clouds, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. It was as if the world itself was taking a deep breath after narrowly escaping destruction. Chuck Norris leaned against the hood of one of the vans, his face pale, but calm. The effort of sealing the dimensional breach had taken its toll on him. Dark circles shadowed his eyes and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the glowing staff. Despite his exhaustion, he exuded an aura of quiet strength, a testament to his unwavering resolve. Karen Miller sat nearby, scribbling furiously in her notebook. Her mind buzzed with questions, ideas, and emotions she couldn't quite sort through. She glanced up at Chuck occasionally, marveling at how much she'd learned about him in such a short time. He wasn't just a man. He was a guardian, a warrior, and perhaps even a symbol of hope for humanity. Yet, despite his incredible power, he carried himself with humility, always placing others before himself. Pat Doyle paced back and forth, her thoughts racing. The events of the night had shaken her to her core, forcing her to confront not only the existence of otherworldly threats but also her own prejudices and fears. For years she'd hidden behind anger and aggression, using them as shields to protect herself from vulnerability. But now, stripped of those defenses, She felt exposed and strangely free. As she looked at Chuck, she realized he hadn't judged her for her past mistakes. Instead, he'd given her a chance to redeem herself, to fight alongside him rather than against him. Dr. Alan Grant tinkered with his equipment, double-checking the readings from the dimensional scanner. Though visibly tired, his excitement was palpable. "This changes everything," he muttered under his breath, adjusting a dial on the device. "If we can detect these breaches early enough, we might be able to prevent future invasions entirely." As the group prepared to leave the warehouse, Chuck called them together. "Before we part ways," he began, his voice steady but tinged with urgency, "there are things you need to understand. What happened here tonight is only the beginning. The forces we faced are persistent, and they will try again. You must remain vigilant." Alan nodded solemnly. "We'll keep refining the technology. With your help, I think we can create a network of sensors to monitor weak points across the globe." "And I'll write about this," Karen added, clutching her notebook tightly. "Not everything, not yet, but enough to warn people without causing panic. People deserve to know what's out there." Pat stepped forward, her expression resolute. "I'll do better, not just as a cop, but as a person. I won't let fear control me anymore." She paused, glancing at Chuck. "Thank you for showing me another way." Chuck smiled faintly, his gaze sweeping over the group. "Each of you has shown courage and resilience. That is why I believe humanity has a chance. But remember, this mission isn't mine alone. It belongs to all of us now." In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such extraordinary events. Karen published her article, carefully weaving facts with subtle hints of the larger truth. The piece went viral, sparking debates and discussions online. Some dismissed it as fiction, while others took it as a call to action. Regardless, Karen knew she'd planted a seed, one that might grow into something greater over time. Alan threw himself into his work, collaborating with scientists around the world to develop new tools for detecting and combating interdimensional threats. His lab became a hub of innovation, attracting curious minds eager to contribute to the cause. Though progress was slow, every breakthrough brought them closer to ensuring humanity's safety. Pat, meanwhile, underwent a profound transformation. She attended counseling sessions to address the root causes of her behavior and actively sought opportunities to make amends. At the precinct, she became an advocate for fairness and accountability, challenging outdated practices and speaking out against discrimination. Her colleagues noticed the change, and though some remained skeptical, many respected her newfound dedication. As for Chuck, he disappeared for a time, retreating to his home to recover from the strain of closing the breach. When he reemerged, weeks later, he seemed different, less burdened, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He continued to guide the team, offering wisdom and support whenever needed, but there was also a sense of finality about him, as if he knew his role in this chapter of Earth's story was nearing its end. One evening, several months after the battle, the group gathered at a small park near the lakefront. The weather was mild, and the setting sun cast golden light over the water. They sat together on a picnic blanket, sharing stories and laughter as they reflected on everything they'd been through. "You've done well," Chuck said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Better than I could have hoped." Karen grinned, nudging him playfully. "That's because we had the best teacher." Pat chuckled, shaking her head. "Who would have thought? Me working with aliens and scientists and whatever you are." "I'm human," Chuck replied with a wry smile. "Just a little older and farther from home." The mood shifted slightly as reality settled in. None of them wanted to say goodbye, but they all understood that their paths were diverging. Chuck's mission was far from over, and his journey would take him beyond Earth's borders once again. "When will we see you again?" Alan asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Chuck hesitated, gazing out at the horizon. "When the time comes, you'll know. Until then, trust in yourselves. You've proven that you're capable of great things." With that, he stood, brushing grass off his pants. The others followed suit, exchanging hugs and heartfelt farewells. As Chuck walked away, disappearing into the twilight, they couldn't help but feel both sadness and gratitude. He had saved them, not just from an alien invasion, but from themselves. Weeks turned into months, and life moved on. Karen's articles inspired countless readers, igniting interest in science and exploration. Alan's inventions revolutionized the field of quantum mechanics, earning him recognition worldwide. Pat became a role model within her department, proving that change was possible even in the most stubborn hearts. And though Chuck Norris was no longer physically present, his influence lingered. In quiet moments, each member of the team remembered his words, his actions, and the sacrifices he'd made. They carried those lessons with them, passing them on to others in their own ways. One crisp autumn morning, Karen received a package in the mail. Inside was a small wooden box etched with intricate symbols. Nestled within was the glowing amulet Chuck had used during the battle. Attached was a note written in elegant script. "Guard this well. It is a reminder of what you've achieved and what lies ahead." Tears welled up in Karen's eyes as she held the artifact close. She didn't know when or where Chuck was, but she felt certain of one thing. Wherever he was still watching over them. And as long as they remembered his teachings, humanity would have a fighting chance. The sun rose higher in the sky, bathing the city in warm light. Somewhere in the vastness of space and time, Chuck Norris stood ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. But for now, Earth was safe, and that was enough.